Young had requested more time to shoot some additional scenes, but with money tight, Hammer closed the production down, and the director was left to make the best of it in post-production. The market had changed, and Hammer was struggling to cope.
I didn't get any inkling that Hammer was going downhill. I think the demise of Hammer came with future movies, because they started going into things like lesbian vampires and the vampire lovers and things like this. And I think there's the Hammer appeals to a particular section of the public, and they are the gothic horror lovers. If you're going to do a Hammer film, it's got to be gothic horror.
With the relative failure of their recent films, Hammer went back to what they did best: Dracula.
I have returned to destroy you.
The box office success of AIP's contemporary Count Yorga films did not go unnoticed when Hammer planned the resurrection of their most famous creation, announced as Dracula Chelsea, then Dracula Chelsea 1972, eventually going before the cameras as Dracula Today. The film's final release title would be the much more evocative Dracula AD 1972. The idea of placing the Count in a contemporary environment was hardly new. Stoker had, after all, used it. Hammer's Count had always been located well and truly in Victoriana, and the company were less than confident about the move. Don Houghton's screenplay reaches an uneasy compromise by having Dracula's movements restricted to a crumbling 19th century church.
And I remember, this is funny, maybe not so funny, well, it was after. I was having dinner that night. I was actually cooking dinner and jumped in my little mini thingy and drove off, sped off from the studio, and I looked behind me and there was flashing light. I thought, oh no, because I was speeding, got stopped by the police. And then I was covered in this, and they looked at me. And they said, what has happened? I said, I know I'm speeding. They said, no, you're speeding, but what's happened to you? I said, oh, I'm all right. It's just blood, it's just blood. They said, what do you mean it's just blood? This was the police. I said, well, it's Kensington Gore. I've just been filming with Dracula. So they actually let me go with a caution, but I got off. Wouldn't do nowadays, I'm sure, but there you go.
The film opens in 1872 with a rousing battle through London between Dracula and his nemesis Van Helsing, ending in the death of the two great enemies. The Count's ashes are secreted just outside the cemetery where Van Helsing is buried.
September the 18th, 1872. 100 years ago to the day.
Christopher Lee was persuaded, cajoled, and begged into donning the cape once more. The actor always claimed he took the role on as a personal favour to Sir James Carreras, partly in response to the suggestion that many people's livelihoods depended on it. Peter Cushing was once again back as Van Helsing for both the prologue and later assisting Scotland Yard come to terms with a Victorian menace in swinging London. Interviewed on set in 1972, Cushing said, "As long as these pictures make money, I will always do them if I'm asked." The best scenes in the film undoubtedly involved Lee and Cushing confronting each other across the desecrated church. Supporting the leads was young actress Caroline Munro, one of the last of Hammer's famous starlets. James Carreras famously spotted her on a Lamb's Navy rum poster and contacted her agent with the offer of a contract.
I got the part in Dracula AD 72. It was kind of a bit of a fluke. I was doing a campaign in England. It was for a men's drink. It was a dark rum, and apparently Sir James and Michael Carreras had seen these big billboards. I did these big billboards in the 70s, early 70s. And it was Sir James actually that saw the poster. It was a big poster of me, and I was wearing a wetsuit with a knife. I looked a bit tough, a bit fierce, I suppose. Anyway, so he used to travel up and down to Brighton, saw the big billboard, and he said, "Oh, I want to, I'd like to see her and get her to read So I went in, did a reading, and they actually offered me a contract. So I was very lucky because I got to do two films with them, which was brilliant.
Playing the ludicrously named Johnny Alucard was actor Christopher Neame, who could be glimpsed amongst the mob in Lust for a Vampire. The film also featured Stephanie Beacham as Jessica Van Helsing, the last in that noble line and the object of the Count's affection. Beacham would grace the likes of The Nightcomers and Inseminoid, but would find her real niche on television shows like The Colbys. Alan Gibson was hired to direct, having previously helmed the thriller Crescendo for Hammer, as well as working on the television series Journey into Fear. Denied the resources he needed, Gibson never really recreated the familiar Hammer style, or indeed carved a more modern Chiller. The soft drugs, trendy fashions, and self-consciously hip dialogue simply jar the audience. The producer's decision to drop the pop group The Faces, fronted by Rod Stewart, in favour of the excruciating Stoneground, is an indication of just how out of touch they were. In March 1972, while Dracula AD 1972 was being prepared for release, Hammer released a trade announcement that Jimmy Sangster was working on a treatment called Dracula is Dead, Alive and Well and Living in London.
We did a lot of promotion shots for that. We all did them, so I suppose it was part of it. I suppose one did. Yeah, there were loads of pictures out there, a lot with Christopher, a lot on our own, so I suppose it's part of it, really. It's part of any film. You know, the promotion is what they're going to use to promote the film after, so it's important.
Warner Brothers hated Dracula AD 1972 and were less than enthusiastic about another sequel.
The nightmare's over.
I think it is.
Unfortunately, Hammer had what became The Satanic Rites of Dracula in production before they realized how badly they had misjudged their audience. The film opens with a staged satanic sacrifice and some full frontal nudity before quickly shifting gear into a spy thriller where vampirism is treated as just another perversion of powerful men. Scotland Yard are called in to help British intelligence and are soon calling on the services of old friend Lorimer Van Helsing. The audience, of course, is already way ahead of the heroes. It is obvious that the reclusive tycoon at the centre of all this mayhem is none other than Dracula himself.
Is that what you want, Count Dracula? A last blaze of utter horror and violence, ghastly annihilation of an entire planet. Is this your own death wish?
Michael Coles, who played the Metropolitan Police's finest in Dracula AD 1972,
My grandfather died fighting a vampire.
returned to recreate his role. Joanna Lumley, in training for her future role as an Avengers girl, takes over from Stephanie Beacham as Jessica Van Helsing. Peter Cushing, of course, was on hand as the unfailing Van Helsing, but the film really belongs to Christopher Lee. It was his swan song in the role, and if the film is barely worthy of his talents, at least it's better than its predecessor. Lee is given the added bonus of some decent lines for a change.
My revenge has spread over centuries and has just begun!
The climactic battle with Van Helsing is almost like old times, and the Count dies a memorable death, plunging through hawthorn bushes only to be impaled on Van Helsing's stake.
The first Frankenstein, you see, made this sensational and financial success that immediately Hammers decided to remake a Dracula picture in colour, and they cast Christopher as Dracula and myself as Van Helsing. It was just one of those things that came about. Christopher and I were always cast for these parts in Hammer pictures, that we have almost become a team, where now that I think our names separately mean something, but together they mean a great deal. So this is how I think this evolved. It wasn't a thing that was set out to happen. It just was one of those things that did occur, purely because of being used so much by this one firm. And I think there's about 7 Draculas, and I've only appeared in, well, it'll be 3 now, with the one that's coming up, because Christopher's played Dracula many, many times without me playing Van Helsing.
The film was the last nail in the Count's coffin as far as Christopher Lee was concerned, telling Cinema TV Today, I have no desire to make any more horror films unless they are good ones. He would be tempted back to Hammer for To the Devil a Daughter, but he had turned his back on his most famous role once and for all. Satanic Rites has some other memorable sequences, notably the genuinely creepy brides of Dracula chained in the cellar and the bloody staking of Valerie van Ost. The film opened in London with AIP's blaxploitation film Blackula, where it was met with the usual sneering reviews and little audience enthusiasm. In America, Warner Brothers declined to be involved, and the film sat on the shelf until 1978, when it was released by Dynamite Films under the absurd title
Count Dracula and his Vampire Bride.
Their films now seemed quaint and old-fashioned. Turning the clock back 20 years, Hammer retreated to the world of thrillers and domestic comedies. The walls of Hammer's Wardour Street offices were now more likely to be decorated with posters for Fear in the Night, On the Buses, or Love Thy Neighbour than one of their horror films. Hammer's search for new ideas seemed to take an unusual turn when Michael Carreras hired Avengers creator Brian Clemens to write and direct what was to become Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter. Clemens, perhaps better known as a television writer, had already made Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, and now offered Hammer the concept of an action horror movie. Girls from the village of Durwood are turning up drained not only of their blood, but of their life essence.
In the 18th century in Central Europe, a black terror swept across the face of the land. The curse of vampirism, which had been a half-forgotten memory for hundreds of years, returned with a fury that struck unholy fear into the hearts of every man, woman, and child.
The audience is informed that there are many species of vampire.
It is commonly supposed that a vampire attacks in only one way, by biting the neck and draining the victim of blood. The girls you spoke of, they were not drained of blood, but of youth, of life itself.
The hero's skill with a blade is the most effective way to kill a vampire in a sword fight.
To the death.
Yes, you bleed, my lord. This is God's blade. Forged for your black heart.
Well, can you see that all right? Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Well, that's one of the stakes, and I think there are only about 6 of them in the film, and I think I'm supposed to have fashioned them all. They were very new wood and light because I saw the movie 2 days ago again, and there are about 6 of them that I get off the back of the cart.
I remember.
And this was one of them.
You see? He's been bitten on the mouth.
God's sake, I survived the vampire's bite.
He is not the man you are.
I'm doomed. My soul a never-ending torment.
Kill me! Kill me!
Clemens cast Horst Janssen in the leading role, a handsome German with athletic build and natural gift for swordplay and horse riding.
Well, the most good-looking leading man I think I've ever worked with.
And one of the nicest.
Yes, a very,
He was
very dear man.
gorgeous inside and
Yeah.
outside, I would
Yeah.
have to say. He wasn't he?
Yeah.
Very gentle
Yes.
and dashing.
And a very hard worker.
Absolutely. Do you remember the fight scene?
Well, I think it's I think maybe it's one of the best fight sequences since the famous one between, have I got it right, Basil Rathbone and
Errol Flynn, I
Errol
think.
Flynn.
Yeah.
Do you remember that Horst Janssen was never around at lunchtime?
He wasn't? No.
He had
you're
a
right.
sandwich, and you know what he was doing. He was rehearsing that fight sequence with
Oh, is
Bill
that what he
Hobbs.
was doing? I thought he was seeing his lovely
Yeah.
wife.
The supporting cast was excellent. Caroline Munro, never more fetching as the gypsy girl Carla. John Cater stole every scene as the hunchback.
The occasion when you see live toads coming out of the box because the carriage or whoever, the vampire has gone near it or over it.
Yes, that's right.
What makes them live.
Yeah, it comes to life.
Highly probable, I think.
Oh, yes.
John Carson played the honest Dr. Marcus, and Shane Bryant, who for a short time was being tipped by Michael Carreras for major stardom, also featured. Wanda Ventham played the villain of the piece, the evil Lady Durwood, the life-draining vampire.
Yours. Her youth will pulse through your veins, my darling, replenishing, restoring. Take her.
At your service, sir.
Michael Carreras wasn't impressed. He felt the director had misjudged the tone, and although the film's ending was left deliberately open for future adventures, it wasn't to be.
I mean, the end of the film, you think that Kronos and Gross are going to go on and solve dozens more.
But they were.
Were they going to do that?
Oh, yes, that was the whole idea. I think Cronus meaning time traveller, and I think the whole idea was that they did. And it was in Germany, all these comics. Have you ever seen them, John?
I have. I've got one. Somebody sent me one.
Because they all went on.
Yeah.
She wasn't left, or she came back, or she went off with them.
I'm so sorry. I haven't seen another story. All I've seen is a comic which tells the story that
of our
we're
story,
in.
right?
Yes.
Oh no, they go on. They actually do go on, which would have been, I think, Brian wanted it to go on, which would have been wonderful, wouldn't it?
Hammer was now announcing far more films than they were making. In a market glutted with horror films, Michael Carreras found he could not interest financiers in Hammer product. Amongst the many films that stayed on the shelf were Victim of His Imagination, Kali, Demon Bride of Dracula, and, perhaps most famous of all, Vampirella. Warner Brothers, the producers of Bruce Lee's first mainstream movie Enter the Dragon, had an open arrangement with Hammer over distribution of their Dracula films. The omens all looked positive. The legend of the 7 golden vampires looked at the outset to be a perfect match of Hammer's technical skills and Hong Kong's Shaw Brothers finance. The period setting was restored. Don Horton's script opens in 1804, with Carr, an Oriental disciple of the occult, who has journeyed to Transylvania to seek out his master. A century later, Van Helsing is in the Far East on a lecture tour, and he is persuaded to travel to the remote village of Ping Quay to rid them of the legendary golden vampires. There was only one choice for Van Helsing. Peter Cushing was glad to be back, though he was less enamoured by the Hong Kong locations.
Peter Cushing was lovely. Cushing said to me, I was after a stand-in. He said, oh, John, they don't have stand-ins here, you know. They don't worry about it, but that's the way they are over here. That was Cushing, because Cushing was lovely. He had lost his wife 2 or 3 years before, and he never got over it.
Hammer's deal was in fact for 2 films. The second co-production, which also featured Cushing, was a thriller called Shatter and followed on immediately. Amongst the Europeans in the cast, Hammer contributed the statuesque Julie Edge, whom James Carreras had dubbed the sex symbol of the 70s. Robin Stewart, best known for the sitcom Bless This House, played Leyland Van Helsing and provides the love interest with local girl Shi Su. With Christopher Lee out of the running, the role of Dracula, seen only in the opening and climax of the film, went to John Forbes Robertson.
But when I saw the 7 golden vampires, wasn't it? When you first see him, he rises out. I believed in it completely, and I believed when I was doing it utterly and completely that I was Dracula. When I appeared out of the coffin, you know, like that, and they put a plank behind, and I came up like that. I thought, Jesus God, he does look like a spectre.
Shaw Brothers contract player David Chang, a martial arts expert rather than an actor, with a string of minor hits, took on the nominal hero role. The remaining parts were all filled by local Chinese actors. The film was shot entirely on location in Hong Kong by a mixed British and Chinese crew during October and December 1973, under the direction of Roy Ward Baker.
Roy Ward Baker, lovely director. He had taken his own approach, which they found standoffish, and he wasn't standoffish at all.
It wasn't the happiest of experiences for Baker, who found himself constantly at odds with the local technicians. And in the end, the fight scenes were staged without his participation.
When I got there, I heard that he'd stirred up the Chinese. Lovely, lovely, warm director, but very professional. I think he wouldn't have suffered fools gladly.
Peter Cushing, despite looking gaunt and frail, contributes an energetic performance, and the scene of the undead vampires rising from the graves gave some hope of better things to come, but it was not to be. The film was cheap and ineffective and proved once and for all that the Hammer era was finally over. The film did moderately well in Britain, and Warner Brothers felt it merited a release in less discerning parts of the world, but not the US. The kung fu craze was on the wane. The film was left on the shelf for 5 years before being re-edited and shorn of 17 minutes by Dynamite Entertainment and released as The Seven Brothers Meet Dracula. The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires marked the last film Peter Cushing made for Hammer. It was also the last film James Bernard scored for them, and the last in a long and noble line of vampire films. As the 70s came to a close, Hammer was relegated to the world of the small screen, with Hammer's House of Horror. By the early 80s, Hammer had ceased to exist as a production entity, with only the occasional announcement of a new project to keep the brand alive. For its fans, Hammer remains a style, a genre, a familiar promise of something dark and deadly. The Hammer vampire film is dead, but refusing to lie down. They still live on in late-night movies, in DVDs, and in our imagination.
They were taken very seriously, weren't they? I think I'm sure if you asked Lee the same thing. They all took themselves very seriously. They had to believe in what they were doing. And it's a period which can never come back. You'll never see it again like that, will you? You see, I think that's partly it. That's all I can think of. Long time ago. Distant memories.
What is the enduring appeal of these Gothic movies? I have not the faintest idea. And I say it at the festivals when I get up on stage. I look at the audience, I look at them and I say, none of you were born when I was making these movies. And that is the thing, the fan base is, the sort of the 30s, 30, and the kids. None of them were born when we were making these movies. And I cannot to this day understand why. I'm delighted about it because I get to go to all these festivals. I become a cult figure in my old age. And we're getting thin on the ground, the Hammer cult figures. Not many of us left.
And they were very good. They were very well made, very well cast, very well directed. And anybody who was in them, like me, are very proud and pleased to have been part of them.
So I don't know. I like to think that I contributed to it, whatever it was. But apparently, we did create a little cult of some sort. And I'm very proud that we did.